And we are live in the Storycraft Cafe. I am your host, Hank Garner. Today, I am super excited to welcome a panel of guests to talk about short story writing and specifically alternative historical fiction short story writing. Henry Hertz is the captain of this ship, Combat Monsters, Untold Tales of World War II. Uh, Henry has authored 14 picture books and edited 8 anthologies for Albert Whitman and Company, Blackstone Publishing, and others. His short stories have been published by Weird Tales, Baen Books, Pseudopod, Metastellar, Titan Books, Highlights for Children, and Ladybug Magazine. He holds a BS in Engineering from Cornell University, an MS Engineering from George Washington University, and an MA in Political Science from Georgetown University. Welcome, Henry. Thank you for joining us today.
Thanks, Hank.
Scott Sigler is a New York Times best-selling author. He's the creator of 18 novels, 6 novellas, dozens of short stories, and thousands of podcast episodes. He's an inaugural inductee into the Podcasting Hall of Fame. His podcast fans fervently anticipate their weekly story fix, so much so they've dubbed themselves Sigler Junkies and have downloaded over 50 million episodes. Welcome to the show, Scott. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. Excited.
Absolutely. And then David Mack is the award-winning New York Times bestselling author of more than 36 novels and numerous short story works of science fiction, fantasy, and adventure, including the Star Trek Destiny and Cold Equations trilogies. Mack's writing credits span television for episodes of Star Trek Deep Space Nine, film, and comic books. He also has worked as a consultant on the animated television series Star Trek Lower Decks and Star Trek Prodigy. The International Association of Media Tie-in Writers honored him as a Grand Master with its Faust Award. Welcome to the show. Thank you for joining us, David.
Thank you.
And we're hoping to be joined by Jonathan Mayberry, who will hopefully chime in shortly. But regardless, let's get started here. Henry, Combat Monsters, what an epic collection of short stories. I was telling you before we started that the topic of the show is very close to my heart because we are starting a short story challenge of sorts starting in March, where we're going to take a panel of writers who don't think that writing short fiction is necessarily their strong suit. And we're going to attempt to master this art in hopes that mastering the short story, which is is an accomplishment all on its own, but hopefully mastering that art will make you a better novelist. First off, what do you think of that idea that mastering short fiction makes you a better writer in general? And how did you get started with short fiction and with anthology work and collecting works from different authors, all of that?
I do think writing short stories is helpful to novel writers, although writing a short story and writing a novel are different animals, even excluding the fact that obviously one is much longer than the other. You have a lot more structure and opportunity for detail in a novel that you don't have in a short story. I got my start writing picture books, which is the ultimate in brevity. They're like 500 word stories. And so it was a natural transition for me to start writing short stories because I had never written a full novel at that point. And so I thought, well, at least I can get up the learning curve faster, because even just sentence construction is different in a picture book than it is in adult short stories. And so it's a lot easier to ask a friend to critique a 5,000 word story than a 100,000 word novel. So, and it's, you get more repetitions in 5,000 word increments than you do on 100,000 word novels. So it was just a way to get my reps in and improve my writing for older audiences. And then from there, I ended up writing short stories for middle grade, young adult, and adult audiences, and then moved into organizing anthology.
How do you go from writing picture books to writing alternative history World War II stories? That seems like such a jump, or is it?
So I've always been a fantasy and science fiction fan since elementary school. Where the Wild Things Are, Lord of the Rings.
Sure.
Middle school, I'm reading Dune. So uh, it's always been an interest of mine. And you know what? Some of my picture books are fantastical. I have one with dinosaur pirates and one with all kinds of monsters. So it's really fantasy and science fiction are not. Oh, and I have one with space pirates. So there's really no limit on genre for writing picture books other than the really dark stuff. Um, so it's not as weird as it seems to go from. It's not the genre switch; it's really the market switch to go from picture book writing to writing for adults. And like I said, you really have to. I had to. It's funny. So I had a college education. I had only written for work, so dry technical stuff. I started writing picture books. I had to unlearn some of the things to write for picture books because it's quite a different animal than writing for adults. And then when I switched to writing short stories and longer works, I've written a couple of middle grade novels. I had to relearn writing, for older audiences.
Gotcha. David, how do you feel about the art form of the short story? How do you feel that it differs from novel writing? And did you begin writing short fiction or long fiction? And we're going to welcome Jonathan Mayberry to the show as as David gets ready to answer that question, but wanted to take a moment to welcome Jonathan. Thank you for joining us today.
Yeah, sorry for being late too. We had power and heat out since the middle of the night, so it just kind of came back on a few minutes ago. So we're out of the Stone Age and back with my colleagues here.
Well, we're in the deep South, and last week we had snow and ice, which is completely out of the typical for the deep South. And then today we're back to 70 degrees, where it belongs. So I have a little bit of sympathy for you there. So David was, I was just asking David, how do you feel about the form of short stories? And did you begin writing short? Did you begin as a novelist and then try your hand at short fiction? How was your personal progression?
I started out writing in television.
Okay.
My first professional sale of fiction was to Star Trek Deep Space Nine. So I was writing for TV back in the 90s.
So you just
I transitioned from there into novellas.
Okay.
So I was writing ebook novellas for the Star Trek SCE series. And I had a few of those published, and they got some good reviews and good sales. And I was invited up to write full-length novels about 20 some odd years ago. So I started out in prose, working in longer form, novella and then novel. And then there were opportunities for themed Star Trek anthologies where I got to try some short fiction. I found it was a little bit difficult for me going from having all the room in the world to having to get the whole story done in 3,000 words. It's like, I barely get up to speed. I'm barely at liftoff in 3,000 words, and now they want a whole story in 3,000. So in that respect, learning the art of the short story helped me immensely in that it taught me the value of concise prose, evocative prose. If you can do more with fewer words, the better. And it also just taught me about pacing, that there's a need to focus a short story in a way that a novel can sprawl. It can have lots of viewpoints. It can kind of go all over the place and even be slightly experimental. A short story, it can also be experimental, but I think it requires, in most cases, a tighter focus. You've got to know who the story is about, what it's about, and you got to stay on target. Yeah, there's not really a lot of room for detours and diversions, at least not in the early phases of learning to do it. I'm not at the point where I'm ready to go off on wild tangents in a short story. More experienced writers can probably get away with that. I'm not at a point where I can get away with that.
Understood. Scott, you have taken short fiction to another level and you have released a lot of your short fiction as podcast episodes, which is a form that I deeply love. I've been podcasting about as long as you have in different, not long after Adam Curry invented the form, I was digging in and playing with it. But I love to see how people take a new form and do something new and unique with it. How did you get started writing short fiction, and then this unique delivery method that you figured out? How has that affected what you do?
Well, with the short fiction, I I kind of always knew I wanted to be a writer and got a journalism degree, went to work in newspapers. And I think it was when I graduated college, I'm like, I'm going to become a full-time writer. That was the goal. Had not written a novel at that point. So I decided I was going to write a short story a week for 52 weeks for my first year of focus on the craft. And
like Ray Bradbury said that we should.
Is that Ray? I probably picked it up from him. I can't remember where I got it from.
Yeah,
but
I think his quote was, by the time you get to 50 weeks, surely you can't write 50 bad short stories.
I think I made it to week 16 before I started on my first novel, but all 16 of those I further developed later on when I got better at things. And when I started podcasting in 2005, I just started reading my own unpublished novels, starting out with Infected, then Ancestor, then Earth Core, and finally the rookie book one of the Galactic Football League series. And then after that came out, that's when I wound up getting my book deal. But I just podcast those a chapter a week to get through those. So, and then I switched over to short stories and I ran out of novels. So I started podcasting those same 16 short stories I wrote and was writing more along the way. And it became a focus on, I realized my success in the form of podcasting was coming because I was there every week for years on end. And a lot of the people doing fiction podcasts at the time would do, here's a couple of short stories, here's a novella, here's a novel. Then they would go away while they worked on something else and largely just be forgotten because that's the nature of the podcasting space. So in that urge to keep continually putting work out week after week, I wrote a whole bunch more short stories, and then eventually was lucky enough to be invited to write short stories for various anthologies and things. I've written several for Jonathan, for example, and eventually those rights come back and everything winds up in the podcast feed at some point.
Love it. I love it. Jonathan, you joined us a few minutes late, so I'll just touch on your short bio here. Jonathan Mayberry is a New York Times bestselling author, 5-time Bram Stoker Award winner, 4-time Scribe Award winner, Inkpot Award winner, comic book writer. His Vampire Apocalypse book series V Wars became a Netflix original series. He writes horror, science fiction, epic fantasy, thriller, and more. He's the president of the International Association of Media Tie-In Writers and the editor of Weird Tales magazines. And you have had your hand in a number of short story anthologies over the years. Many of them I have read and loved. How does writing the short story fit into all of the different expressions of writing that you're into? How do you feel like that it fits as a tool in your writer toolkit? What does writing short stories do for your creative process?
Oh, it's writing short stories has been a really big part of my process. Though at first I didn't want to do it. When I went from being a nonfiction guy writing, about 1,200 feature articles and about 20 nonfiction books, and that was all fine. When I broke into fiction, it was with novels, and I had no interest in writing short stories because, kind of as David mentioned, the ideas that come into my head are not short ideas. I want to write big stories. So sure. I didn't really plan on writing short stories. What happened is in the space of 2 days, I got invited to 2 different anthologies to write short stories. And they both happened at the same time. One was, I forget who edited the anthology, but it was all short stories set in West Virginia, based on West Virginia folklore. And which I'm from Philadelphia, so, I'm not from West Virginia. I had to do research. And the other was a friend, Kim Paffenroth, was editing an anthology of zombie stories set in different historical eras. And they both asked for short stories, and I sat down to try to write them. And every time I would write them, I'd get, like, trying to write a 5,000 word short story, I'd get about 7,000 words in and realize I'm at the beginning yet. And it was frustrating. So I had to fall back, and I've always loved reading short stories.
Yeah.
And you mentioned Bradbury. Bradbury is the one that turned me on to short stories. He gave me several books of short stories when I was a kid. And I just went back and did my homework. I read them, and I outlined several of my favorites to understand the form. I always love knowing the form and the structure of something. And then sat down and tried it again. And I wound up writing a Sherlock Holmes story for the West Virginia anthology, which actually makes sense based on when Sherlock Holmes was supposed to be in America. And with a bit of folklore that they assigned to me, they kind of lined up. And it was like, oh. And the other one, I wrote a comedy zombie short story set during the Great Fire of Chicago. And they both came in on the right word count, both came in, with complete arcs and so on. And it surprised me because I didn't think I was going to be able to do that. And in the process of trying to do it, I wound up falling in love with the form. Since then, I've published, I think, 173 short stories so far over the last 18 years. And I love the form. Now, what that's done for me as a writer, it does allow for creativity and experimentation. There are things you can do in the short form that are hard to get away with in a novel, because novels, being a bigger product with more money invested by the publisher, they're a little less likely to take experimental stuff. Where a short story, it's going to be in an anthology or a magazine. I could do something experimental, and if it doesn't work, there's not a big loss for anyone in that. But if it does work, then it opens me up to a potentially new audience and allows me to have some fun and growth. Some of my biggest career successes have actually started as short stories. 2 examples. One was I had written a novelette for an anthology, a zombie anthology, edited by Christopher Golden, called The New Dead. And he had wanted us to write stuff that was outside our comfort zone. And up to that point, I had never written a post-apocalyptic story. I'd never written one with a teen protagonist. So I said, well, that's outside my comfort zone. Let me do that. That short story, got into the anthology, and it got a lot of mentions in reviews. And my agent, who usually doesn't read the shorter works, saw it and said, this is the opening of a YA novel. And I'm like, no, it's not. It's the first of many, many arguments I have lost with her. And she said, she just asked if she could take the novel out and shop it as if it's sample pages of a novel. And within a couple of weeks, we had an auction going, and Simon & Schuster, came in high, and that became the Rotten Ruins series, of which there are now 7 books and a movie in development. So that worked. And the other was an anthology John Joseph Adams was editing years ago of Oz short stories. And I had just finished writing a really visceral horror novel. And I thought, Oz, cool. I'll turn the Tin Man into a serial killer, give him the heart of a serial killer, and have him go on a rampage with his axe. And it sounded fun, but it made me then stop and think, well, who the actual audience was. So I reread the Oz books and got into the zone to write a book for the actual audience that reads Oz books, which are younger kids. And that story was pulled out in reviews as well. And I got a reach out from the estate of L. Frank Baum saying that they love the story so much they want to include it as a prequel to Wizard of Oz, an official part of the Oz chronology. At which point I ugly cried for a while, because that was just insane. But both of those things started as short stories. And I've written 52 novels now. And I think 7 of them started off as short stories. So it allows me to play. It also allows me to play with genres that don't work in long fiction, like steampunk. I love the genre. Real hard to sell a steampunk novel and have it be successful.
Right.
But steampunk short fiction does well. So I got to play with that, with Westerns, with genres where I don't have book contracts and may not ever have. It's allowed me to do that, which constantly grows me as a writer, because every time a weird pitch comes from an editor and says, hey, do you want to write this? I tend to take the ones that are weirder, because that's where the growth opportunity is. And anytime a writer can grow in their skill set, they're going to have a lot of fun doing it. So, I mean, short stories have been integral. Plus, over the years, my love of short stories has encouraged me to edit. And I've edited 26 anthologies, 27, one that will be announced sometime soon. And I'm the editor of Weird Tales, so I deal with short stories all the time. And the more I study the form, the more I'm involved with the form, the more I understand more and more of the creative process in myself and in my colleagues, and also understand what the readers really want. Some of it's like candy to them. It's fun playing in worlds where I get to do a complete work in a day or two and have fun. And I can go back to my novel, but that's done now, and I've learned something from it, and maybe provided something that's going to be more fun for the editors and readers.
We've mentioned Ray Bradbury a couple of times, and his advice to that everyone should start by writing short stories. And he kind of tongue in cheek says, well, surely if you do one a week, surely you can't write 50 bad short stories. You'll eventually stumble on onto the ability. And that's a little flippant, but I think it was said with humor. And people, and
you're breaking up, Hank, and you're frozen.
All right then.
Apparently I'm not the only one having technical issues over here.
Well, Henry, this is still recording, so why don't you jump in and ask a couple of questions until Hank gets back?
Henry, you're muted.
You're muted, bud.
Why don't each of you give us an overview of the short story you wrote for Combat Monsters until Hank can rejoin us? David, you want to start?
Sure. Really quickly, my story is called Boxcar.
Are we back? Are we back?
Oh, you're back.
You're back, Hank. We were just about to talk about our stories in the anthology.
Yeah, it had. So anyway, how about technology for you? I was saying that that Ray Bradbury gave that advice, and someone said to me, well, the market was very different when he was giving that sort of advice. You could pitch short stories to different literary journals, and they were much more prominent. And today's market is really set up for novel publishing and that sort of thing. How do you feel that the market for selling short stories, other than in anthologies like we're here talking about today, is there a market for short story authorship and for selling those stories, other than the collected anthologies like we're talking about today? Like, is that a viable market for writers today?
I'd like to jump in on that one.
Yeah, absolutely. Anybody that has thoughts.
Anthologies are hot, but anthologies, one of the things about that, anthologies don't sell as well as novels. So the bigger houses tend to be a little hesitant. They still will publish, but they're a little hesitant. The mid-sized publishers and the smaller houses are the ones where anthologies are part of their business. They usually can't afford the advances for novels, and anthologies is a little more marketable, and they're able to get them out and feed the market. Magazines still exist. A lot of them are digital, but they still exist. Lightspeed, Nightmare Magazine, Weird Tales, Clarksville. There's a bunch of magazines out there. But also, you have Audible does Audible Shorts, does singles, sure. And they do short story collections. Sometimes they do anthologies, but sometimes they'll also do a single author, like a 5-story collection. That's viable. You have things like Smashwords and other utilities where independent publishers can put up short stories. You have podcasting like Scott does, where people hear. I know I've talked to several people who found Scott because of his free content online. Then they start realizing he has books out there, not just the short stories, and they follow that. They're great when you're doing a reading because you can do a complete story reading as opposed to a fragment of a novel. In fact, when I do a novel book launch and have to do a reading, I actually read a short story. I don't read from the novel itself. There's a lot that's going on with short stories, and there may not be as many markets as there were back in the pulp eras and during the 60s and so on, but it doesn't mean it's going away. It's just it's spread out throughout the digital world of different play and print world for where you can sell and publish short work. So. And I see it coming back a little more strongly too. People are talking about short stories. All the awards categories always have a short story category.
Mm-hmm.
Fantastic. Scott, how do you feel about the market for short stories?
Well, on my podcast, I will put up short stories and then run advertising against those like I do with all my full-length serialized books too. So
Sure.
it's great content. It's an easier ask of the audience to listen to a short story that is in 1, 2, or 3 parts than in one of my longer running novels, serialized novels, which run anywhere from 27 to 42, 45 episodes. When it's all done, people can go through and consume everything. But while you're putting content out there, it's a lot easier to entice new listeners to give you a try. There's, oh, here's 5, 6 short stories. I can listen to this in an afternoon and get a bunch of different flavors for what he does. On the print side, I've kind of been focused on the novels and podcasting side of things. So I haven't really explored that market much in a while. When people like Henry or Jonathan are kind enough to invite me to put in a short story, that I tried to get those done, but I'm really not that adept on the current state of the short story marketplace as far as putting them into print or ebook.
Gotcha. David, what about you? Do you have thoughts on the viability of the short story writer in today's market?
Not really, because it's not my market. I mostly write novels, and I take on longer form projects like audio drama. Short stories I tend to write only by commission for anthologies such as this one. I have a lot of friends I follow online who are short story writers or short story editors. So from them, I gather that the market is much broader than people realize it is. There are a number of digital online publications out there. Some of the bigger ones tend to dominate the award categories of the Nebula and the Hugo. I get the feeling that while there is a market to sell, it's not a market where you can, quote unquote, make a living. Like back in, say, the 70s, you could, in theory, sell short stories to major publications, men's magazines, that sort of thing, and make enough money that you could actually, selling a few short stories a year, or say 5 or 6 of those, actually have a decent life as a writer, even without having to write novels. Those days are gone. These days, if you write short fiction and that's your primary sort of outlet, I would say you probably either need to have a good partner with insurance or you need to have a good day job, because you are probably not going to make rent by yourself doing just short stories. There may be exceptions to this rule, but from what I've seen of the per word rate compared to the cost of living, it seems like a very difficult road.
Yeah. I like to think of it as another tool in the writer's toolbox. Is that and in this day and age, you need to be proficient in a number of areas. That's just the fact of the economy and the world we live in.
Can I throw one thing in on that too, real quick?
Absolutely.
I totally agree with what David said. It isn't something you're going to make a living at unless you're an exceptionally rare person like Joyce Carol Oates and so on. But what it does do is it builds visibility for you as a writer. Especially when breaking in, sometimes you get into an anthology where there'll be some marquee names on the cover, and your story is in there. You may not be the reason they bought the book, but the readers will see your work, and if they like it, your bio says how to find you, and it does good for building brand and building career visibility. So it's not same as having direct money in the bank, but it is part of building the career that puts money in the bank. So yeah.
Understood.
Absolutely agree.
Yeah. Henry, when you're putting together a collection like Combat Monsters, walk us through kind of the origins of a project like this. How do you come up with a common theme? And then how do you go about inviting these authors knowing that they're going to have completely different outlooks on this common theme? And that's one of the great things about a short story anthology, is that you start with a common theme and everyone that comes to it has a different idea that sparks from that. And that's one of the fun things about digging into a short story anthology, is seeing how every different voice is going to interpret this completely differently.
Well, I can't answer your first part of your question because it's the same kind of question people say, where do you get your ideas for novels?
Right.
It's creative process. The ideas pop into your head from something you saw, something you watched, something you drank, something you smoked, but you get an idea. And so I don't remember when it happened, but I was like, I'm very interested in World War II. I could call myself a World War II buff, and of course, I love writing fantasy and sci-fi. Anything with monsters always interests me. And I was like, hey, I got a literary peanut butter and chocolate situation going on here. Why don't I combine those two things?
Right.
That would make a great theme for an anthology. What if the actual outcomes of World War II were influenced by monsters and we didn't know about it? Like it's only been recently unearthed or released, classified documents finally unclassified to let us know that there were monsters involved. And so that's how I come, ideas for anthologies just kind of pop into my head. And then I also have to think, okay, do I think there's a market for it? In the case of combat monsters, it was like, there's plenty of people that love World War II and military fiction, and there's plenty of people that love fantasy and sci-fi. So it's like, yeah, there'll definitely be a market for this. All right, so now I have to build a proposal to send to publishers. And to do that, of course, I want to have some headlining authors. So my first criteria is, do they have facial hair? And you can see that everybody here meets that criteria. And then I look at, are they best-selling authors, which is a short way of saying, a shortcut to, do they have writing skills? Do they have game? And so I make a list and I start inviting people. It's sort of a tentative or a provisional thing. It's like, hey, if I were to sell this anthology with such and such a theme, and I could pay you at least this rate, would you be okay with me adding your name to the proposal? There's no commitment on your part. And then if I sell it, I'll come back and say, hey, this is what I can pay you. You want to do it? And I do that until I have a solid number of authors that, okay, the proposal's fleshed out. It doesn't have to be all the authors, because I do like to have a mix of well-known and lesser well-known authors, because, hey, the lesser well-known authors, myself included, like a leg up. And so getting into an anthology with some better known writers is it's good for them, good for their career. And you can discover, well, it's not that I'm discovering it, but the readers will discover new authors that they hadn't heard of that they might love.
Gotcha. What, Henry, tell us about the story that you came up with for this anthology. What was the initial kernel of an idea that came to you?
Sure. So I'll tell you, let me just give you a 1 to 2 sentence back history. Okay. I got my interest in World War II started in junior high when I started playing a tabletop board game called Panzer Blitz, which is a tactical level armored, yeah, Scott knows, tactical level armored warfare on the Eastern Front. So Russians and Germans, Soviets and Germans. So, and the biggest tank battle in the history of the world was at Kursk, which is in the news now because the Ukrainians punched into the Kursk Oblast against the Russians. So, okay, I want to set it in the big tank battle. And I was like, I'm going to theorize this monstrous mechanical tank that the Germans come up with. And I needed to have a monster that the Soviets would enlist in fighting against that mechanical monstrosity. And so that's the I didn't want to give away spoilers, but that's what gets the story going.
Love it. David, what was the genesis for your story?
Well, the idea behind Boxcar was a mutiny aboard the B-29 that is going to drop the second atomic bomb, not the first on Hiroshima, but the second one on Nagasaki. That aircraft in real life was named Boxcar. So I came up with the idea of using as much of the real historical detail of that mission as possible, right down to the names of the crew members are the people who were aboard the aircraft. Although the story bears no resemblance to their real lives and should not be interpreted in that sense. Let's just legally get that one out there.
Sure.
There was no mutiny as far as anyone knows. But in this story, there is, and it comes down to the fact that they're trying to figure out why they have to drop this second atomic bomb. And it turns out that what they're fighting over is the fact that the first atomic bomb that was unleashed a kaiju. And that kaiju is stomping all over Japan. They say, why is that our problem? Because if it gets big enough, it's going to stomp on the entire planet. Better to kill it there now than have to kill it in San Francisco a year from now. So there's a sort of ongoing struggle of viewpoints aboard the aircraft. It's very tense. It's happening almost in real time. You know, they've got minutes counting down to when they either have to drop the bomb or abort. And it was fun in that when I dug into the reality of Boxcar, the real mission was plagued by problems, almost to the point where they thought they were cursed. Where Enola Gay's mission went off like clockwork, Boxcar's mission was just a series of screw-ups from the very beginning. They took off late. They took off into a storm, into a typhoon. They had mechanical problems, electrical problems, navigation malfunctions. They thought there was a gremlin aboard the aircraft at one point. They missed their rendezvous with what was supposed to be their electronics plane, their photographic and electronics plane. Turns out they were at the right coordinates, but they were at wrong altitudes.
Oh, no.
So they hung out as long as they could. Then they had to continue on to target without their backup plane. And then they had to switch targets twice. And then after they dropped the bomb in real life, they barely made it home. They came down. They barely got back to, I guess, a nearby U.S. airstrip. They were coming in hot. They were told they were being waved off. No, no, no. And they said, too bad. They sent up every flare they had. Say, basically, we're coming down whether you like it or not. They got down and found out they had something like a gallon of fuel left in the tank. They were literally on fumes by the time they touched down. Another minute in the air and they would have just dropped out like a rock. So it's like adding to the drama of the real mission was hard, but I tried to find a way to do it.
I will say that David did a masterful. So there's like 3 factions arguing on the aircraft, and David does a masterful job of. That would be very hard. That could be very hard to keep track of, and David does a masterful job in keeping.
Well, I mean, there's a lot of guys on the aircraft, but there's only 3 points of view in the story: the leader of the mutineers, the captain of the aircraft, and the guy whose job it is to guard the bomb. Because those are Navy guys who guard the bomb. And then you got your Army Air Force guys who are in charge of the plane. So it's really just captain, mutineer, and guy stuck in the middle with the bomb. There's other characters who are named and are part of it, but by limiting it to those 3 points of view, it stays tight enough to work as a short story.
Over the past 5, 6, maybe close to 10 years in publishing, there's been a resurgence or an interest in historical fiction, specifically around World War II. And I have a theory about that is in our educational system, the farther away we get from an event, the more you're forced to condense that event down into a series of bullet points. I mean, that's just, as history goes on, the further we get, the less we know about it. And historical fiction is a way for us to kind of resurrect some of these stories and fill in some of the blanks so that the heart of the matter doesn't get lost, if you will. Alternative history is a fun twist on that because we can dig out some pertinent details about a thing and then speculate what if. Scott, tell us about your story and what fun is it to play the what if game?
My story is Svarthund, which is Norwegian for black dog. Excuse me. There was an effort by the British, the Special Operations Executive, British Commandos, to try and stop heavy water production at the Vemork hydroelectric power plant in Norway. And that was occupied land by the Germans at the time. And there was an arms race to see who could develop the atom bomb first. So the Allies knew that the heavy water produced there was a critical element of the Germans producing the bomb. And so they set out a couple of different missions to try and sabotage that. The first one, Grouse, was all English guys paratroopers who came in and that mission failed. And then there were 2 following ones called Freshman and Gunnerside. And they're fascinating stories because some of the people who survived the first operation lived for many months up in the mountains, literally surviving on reindeer and anything they could find, because they couldn't build fires because the Germans would come get them. They couldn't do anything to send a signal out. Germans could come get them. And then the final operation, Gunnerside, was successful in sabotaging that. And it wasn't a giant dam exploding. It wasn't any great kaiju stomping around. In real history, it was a very small little thing. They sort of blew up the collection process for that. And that set the Germans back far enough that the Allies were able to develop bomb first and bomb Japan with it, which effectively ended the war. So I combined that with, since the British Special Forces were a huge part of this and training the Norwegians, I brought in a little bit of English folklore, the black dog legend, which is when people see this black dog as a portent of doom. And if you see it, you're probably going to die. And there's all this doom and gloom associated with it. It's not just English legend. It's in several places in the world. So I brought in Aleister Crowley from England, who joins the British Special Forces. And he actually is able to control the black dog in a particular way. And he joins the Special Forces and the Norwegians to go in and try and stop the heavy water from being developed. So it was a ton of fun. I learned an enormous amount about something I'd really never heard of before. I'd heard it in passing, but an absolutely critical moment in World War II that possibly changed the course of history. And then because I'm writing it for Henry, we needed monsters, able to bring in the black dog and watch the fun from there, and then got to kill a bunch of Nazis, which is always a great thing.
Was the black dog or Crowley the monster? I don't know.
The black dog is the monster. Aleister Crowley is actually in the story as Gerard Armont, which is one of his many pseudonyms and aliases. The guy had dozens and dozens of those. So that's meant to be kind of an Easter egg for anybody who happens to read that story and know a little bit about the occult, might read that and be able to put the pieces together. But Aleister Crowley's not actually named. And Aleister Crowley is this mythic figure. So even though the character's in his 50s or possibly 60s, he's just running circles around these young guys, these young commandos who are, scaling 600-foot cliffs and things of that nature.
Love it. Love it. Jonathan, you described your entry into writing short stories as a bit of an adventure. How did you, what was that light bulb moment when you realized that the form of the short story has to be different? It's not just writing a short novel. The form is actually different. And then from what you learned there, how did this story come about, and how do you apply that form to what you wrote here?
Well, to answer the first part of it, the short story thing, since I write novels that are generally pretty densely plotted, very complex things, often an ensemble cast, shifting points of view. And it occurred to me that I was kind of doing short stories in my novels anyway, because I had these vignettes that sometimes is a cutaway character that's only in one scene. So that scene has to be a complete narrative for that character, has to be a complete arc. And when I started writing short stories, I realized that I was already doing that in novel form as chapters, and doing it efficiently within a word count within a chapter, because my chapters tend to be short. And I was like, wait, why am I stressing over this? I'm actually already doing this. I can learn from what I'm doing. So I went into the short story thing as a kind of a vignette approach. It's a moment in time that we capture, sometimes building it out so that there's a little bit of setup, a little bit of, afterward. But the key thing is instead of trying to do a full 3-act structure like I would with a novel, I'm coming in like usually near the end of the second act or the beginning of the third, where things are already in motion. And that's how I write my novels. So once I realized that, it was an easier transition to start doing the short stories. This particular short story, Henry hit me at a really good time for this, because he asked me just after I recovered from COVID. I forget which time. I think it was the first time or second time I had COVID. And when I'm sick, I like doing monster movie marathons when I'm sick, and also action movie marathons. So the previous day, before he asked me, I had watched Fury, a great tank movie. I had watched Overlord, a great horror science fiction monster story set in the hours leading up to the invasion of D-Day, and Dog Soldiers, my favorite werewolf film, which is, British soldiers on maneuvers, war games in the Scottish Highlands where they run into werewolves.
So the pump was primed.
Oh my God! It was and as soon as he said, monsters, World War II, I'm like, yeah, all right,
I'm there.
Yeah. And also, I read the Joe Ledger thriller series, and that series, we sell the books well in advance of my writing them. Like I have 2 more. I just turned in the 2026 book, and I have the 2027, 2028 books. I'm doing research for them now. So I was doing research for the book that I actually just finished, which was about my hero's boss's weird and strangely long lifespan and past. And I knew that I was putting him in different historical eras in the flashbacks in the novel. So when Henry asked me to do this, I'm like, well, I could just do a World War II werewolf story involving that character, character named Deacon, and I can have some fun with it and tie it to my series and tie it to the stuff I watch. So it was one of those perfect storm moments where he asked me to write the right thing at the right time, and as you say, the pump was primed. And also, I'm a huge World War II nerd, and the Battle of Monte Cassino Abbey is a fascinating one because it's a lesser known battle. It ties into kind of remotely to the Monuments Men movie about saving artifacts and so on. And it's a town it was a little abbey that was about to be bombed out of existence by the Allies because they thought it was a bigger German headquarters than it was. So all of that stuff, it made its own perfect storm, like race against time, stuff hidden there, Germans wanting to get out, and the place itself. The battle, that battle was to open a key road to Rome to help with the conquest and freedom of Italy during World War II. It all worked out really well, and I had a lot of fun. And also, it allowed me to bring in a bit of folklore. I've written 5 nonfiction books on supernatural folklore, and there's a werewolf subspecies from Livonia called the Benedante, werewolf against evil on the side of heaven. And I thought, well, that'd be kind of cool to have a good guy werewolf and bad guy werewolves and the SS and my hero's boss all in one story. And so I had way too much fun writing that story. And, it's as historically accurate as possible, except for those details that necessarily need to change. Yeah. But in my head, that is how it actually happened now.
That's a really good point I'd like to amplify, which is when my writing in general, but certainly historical fiction, rooting your fictional story in as much nonfiction as possible, I think it really helps convey authenticity and makes the story more dramatic when there's something that wasn't there, a monster.
Yeah, well,
absolutely. With my story, I followed David's strategy as well. The names of the characters are the real people who were involved in Operation Gunnerside. And, it's just for fictional purposes, but when you portray it in a certain way, it could have happened. It's like an Easter egg for the reader. If they look, oh, this is interesting, I'm gonna look up more about this. And then they recognize the name when they're reading on Wikipedia in a book. It's a ton of fun.
Yeah. History nerds are going to have a lot of fun with the book because every story is tied to a real event. And that when I read the book after I got my contributor copy, I spent way too much time on Google doing research for the different battles and learning. When you're a history nerd, you think you know a lot about a subject, but World War II was so big, it invites an unlimited number of stories to be told.
Yeah, well, my copy, as you see here, is tagged with sticky notes all through where I would flip open and go, what part of this is fiction, and then start, go to Wikipedia, and that's so much fun.
Yeah, I'm showing there's a map that's like the battles are all over the world, so the stories are really diverse in the best possible way in terms of monsters, geography, ethnicity.
So Henry, did you assign certain scenarios, certain battles, or were you just open to whatever your contributors, what grand idea they had at the time? Like, how do you kind of manage what's coming in and who's going to tell what portion of it?
So normally I wouldn't. I don't think it's a good idea to direct people what to write, especially when they're better writers than I am. It's really let them loose, but also make sure that they're deconflicted. So if somebody else had said, "Hey, I think I'm going to do a story in Monte Cassino," I'll be like, "Can you pick somewhere else in Italy because somebody's already doing a story there?" I did not have to deconflict. I mean, the scope of World War II was so vast that it wasn't surprising that everybody chose different geographic areas. I have stuff happening under the water, on the surface of the ocean, on the ground, in the air, across multiple continents, a wide range of monsters. I did not have to do anything except, as the editor, make sure that I didn't want to overlap. Deconflicting. If Jonathan had a werewolf story, if somebody had come in with another werewolf story, I said, "Hey, can you maybe switch monsters?" But I didn't have to. It worked out great.
Love it. Jonathan, you said that you like to start a short story kind of toward the end of Act 2 and kind of rush into that conflict. A lot of fantasy writers, science fiction writers, speculative fiction writers love to set the story. World building is kind of, something we nerd out over, and we can, just build and build and build. When you're writing a short story, you don't have the luxury of all the world building. How do you bring the reader along without having all the backstory and all the things that we are, I don't mean this in a derogatory way, but it almost becomes a crutch for certain writers that you have all of this to build on. But when you don't have that to lean on, and that's really not a good.
No, I get what you're saying, though.
Yeah.
In a novel, you have the luxury of establishing the world and so on, but even that
Yeah.
can be done wrong. Some writers lean so far into world building that they forget that they're trying to tell a story about people.
Right.
So the short story focuses expressly on people. I mean, short stories are more character driven by nature than novels because you don't have the time to build a world. You have to put people in that world. So as a result, what we tell the reader is what the reader needs to know in order to be in that character's head and to follow the character along. There is so much more about the Battle of Monte Cassino, Abby, that I could have written about. And when I did my research, there were big cut and paste sections from historical websites. But as I write it, you carve it down to what the reader needs to know in order for the scenario and the setting to make sense, and then to follow the story and understand the stakes. So it's kill your darlings while writing. You have to be, I mean, and that's something that a lot of writers learn as they go. I mean, we in the beginning don't necessarily trust that the reader gets it or that the reader is able to grasp, what we're trying to say. So we tend to over-explain early on. As we write more, we learn that the readers are very savvy. And in fact, somebody who reads a book like this probably comes into it with both a knowledge of horror fiction, knowledge of adventure stories, and a knowledge of World War II. That's why they picked it up, so that we don't have to handhold as much. And that allows us to get to focus more of the wording on the actual events taking place and take the world building only as needed, just a little bit as needed. In fact, writing stories like this one and a couple other historical things I've done helped me when I started writing epic fantasy, because I didn't stop for big chunks of world building. I just told the reader what they needed to know in order to understand context.
I was talking with Terry Brooks a while back, and he was talking about how storytelling has changed and evolved over the years, and he said, in the Sword of Shannara, you're 80 pages in and nothing has happened. And he said, I could not get away with that. Today you've got to drop, the reader into the story and then,
Yes.
do your world building as you go. And that's just a symptom of, our appetite for fiction changing. And
also, if we over world build in a short story, we are robbing the story itself of its potential to become a more dynamic and exciting piece.
Gotcha. David, how do you feel about the hit the ground running aspect of short story writing?
Well, you're talking to a guy who's trained in TV. The first lesson
Right.
they hammer into you is start every seed as late as possible into the action and get out as early as possible to maintain momentum. If you look at how I approached Boxcar, for instance, I don't have any of the buildup of the mutiny. We opened with the lead mutineer, I believe a guy named Bean, is putting a loaded 45 to the head of the pilot, and he's saying, "You're going to turn this plane around." I mean, that's where we open, is the 45 to the pilot's head. I like to hit the ground running. I like to open with action. And I agree with a lot of what Jonathan said about the need for world building. You need to know your world, but you don't always need to tell everybody everything you know about your world. An editor I worked with early in my career used to call that reporter's disease. Says you do all this fantastic research, you know all this great stuff, and you really want to show it off to people that you've learned all this great stuff, but it has nothing to do with your story. And all it does is slow everything down. The point of that research, in a lot of ways, that is at least what he taught me, is to give yourself the confidence that you know your world, so that when you reach a moment where you need to establish a fact or a detail because it's important to the story, you'll have the confidence to do it because you know your environment, you know your characters, you know your setting. But you also know what isn't important. You know what could be glossed over. I know that, for instance, for Boxcar, all that really mattered is you've got this aircraft. It's a flying tin can. It's hard to move around in. It's precarious. It's cold as hell, especially at 30,000 feet. It's noisy, so they're shouting over engine noise half the time. And I mastered enough of that detail that I can put you in that environment and you feel like you're in this pressure cooker, this tin can. But I don't need to tell you, for instance, about, like, even though I did all this research about all the things that went wrong on the flight and everything that was going to go wrong on the way home, that's great stuff, but it has nothing to do with the story. So it's not in there. All that's there is what you need to know about why are we mutinying, where are we, what's happening, what are the consequences if we fail, and what is the resolution. And that's all we needed, so that's all we got.
Love it. Scott, you have produced audio versions of your short fiction for quite a while. Does that have any bearing on the way you write fiction now after producing it for listeners and knowing that people are consuming this in a little different form? Do you think about that in the writing now, that people may consume it this way?
That's my whole style is influenced by hearing the story as I write it, then having the word processing program read it back to me. And often I'll just read it out loud, and at all points cuts are made and adjustments are made. So my actual writing style is much more attuned to a speaking voice than a reading voice. So my author press are a nightmare for a lot of my copy editors, because I do things like, this sets up the pacing the way someone would actually say it. I'm going to ignore these particular rules of grammar and forget that semicolon. I'm not using it, that kind of a thing. So that, like Jonathan said and David said, that is another way of trimming out a lot of fat of stuff you don't need. When you're reading it out loud and you're getting bored with a piece, or you're reading out loud, like these are very long, cumbersome sentences. By reading it out loud or having the computer read it back to me, I tend to rewrite a lot of sentences, truncate, refine things. I'm a big proponent of Stephen King's On Writing, for you can just print something out and redline all the words you don't need without changing a thing, and usually cut it by 10 to 20% of the actual length. So writing with audio in mind has become my entire style, and it's very helpful for short fiction as well.
I could also speak to that. Once my publisher started doing audiobooks of a lot of the Star Trek novels, and I knew that they were being done for a trilogy of original books I did for Tor, I had to become more aware of how my work was coming across when it was being carried over to audio. And I realized that, as he said, although we're taught that they are invisible when you're reading prose, it becomes very noticeable when you're listening to prose. And so I altered my writing style about 10 years ago to begin accommodating for the fact that I know a lot of this stuff is going to be produced as audiobook. So I started dropping he said, she said, even though this is supposed to be the most invisible of dialogue markers. I would drop that, and instead I would change the focus by putting an action line of integrated action focusing on the character who's going to be speaking next, and then flow out of that action line into their dialogue. And so I tried to eliminate he said, she said, whereas I used to have several hundred in a manuscript. Now I have like maybe I'll let myself use it 5-10 times over the course of a book. But I've really streamlined my prose to make it more accessible and more easily translatable to audio.
That's a fantastic piece of advice.
And everybody's going silent. I can't hear anybody.
Oh. Yeah, but
we can hear you.
Great, David. Yeah. It's been an hour, guys. This has been fantastic. Thank you all for your time. But to wrap up, Combat Monsters will be available February. What's the date, Henry? The 11th.
February 11th.
That's go grab it from your local bookstore. Support local books. If you don't have a great local bookstore, we'll put a link to it in the show notes. One final thing before we wrap up, and I'd love to get each of your perspective on this. We'll start with Henry. If people are listening to this and they don't think that they can write short fiction, they're novelists, they love that form, and they just can't wrap their head around the idea of telling a story in 8,000 words. What piece of advice would you have for them, Henry?
I would suggest pick a genre that they like, read an anthology in a genre that they like, and see how other people do it.
Excellent. David, do you have a piece of advice?
No.
Okay. Scott, what about you?
Just start you give yourself 1 week to write a short story, and you can follow all the various writing guidelines you want. Should the short story be 3-act structure, or do it the way Jonathan suggests? But this is really something I think you only learn by doing. Get the idea, know the beginning, the middle, and the end, and just write it, and know those first couple of short stories are going to suck. They're going to be terrible, and that's totally fine. It's the discipline of starting it and finishing it so that you can then go back and edit it. When you can finish these things, it trips something in your brain. And as you go on to better projects and become a more advanced short story writer, you're going to know in the back of your head, like, this is difficult. I don't know where this is going, but I can figure this out. So I think it's you just put in the reps and start doing them and learn as you go.
So much of life is like that, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Jonathan, how about you? Do you have some advice for writers who just feel like this is beyond their grasp?
Well, yeah, a couple of things. One, read a lot of short stories. I mean, the more you read them, the more you understand how they work. But I'm a structure fan. So every time I go into a new form of writing, whether it's writing a script, writing for comics, writing short stories, whatever, I deconstruct. I reverse engineer. So I take my favorite short stories, and I'll just reverse engineer them back to a bullet pointed outline, not a full stop, just a bullet pointed outline, just to see where the logic goes, see what the equation of cause and effect is that leads to that ending. And you do that a couple of times. You don't need to do it a lot of times. Do it a couple of times with your favorite stories, and then you suddenly have a roadmap for how to build a story that has the same flow. It is about the same length, and so on. It's not as difficult as it sounds, but if you approach it if you take any entry point, a single entry point, for me, it's always structure. Try that, see if that works for you. If not, try listening to them aloud, and reading and listening to short stories aloud often gives you an idea of how to tell a story, because a short story feels more conversational than a novel. So try that. Well, there's a bunch of things you can do. The main thing is, don't try to do it without some kind of preparation or some sort of plan. because then that's where you feel blocked. When you have a plan, it'll take you along the way a certain distance, and the further you go along the way, the more comfortable you are in that journey of writing the story. So find some way to give yourself the comfort of structure until you feel comfortable with the form itself.
Great actionable advice. Combat Monsters, available everywhere February 11th. Go grab it. Henry, David, Scott, Jonathan, thank you guys so much for joining us today, and this has been so much fun. Thank you so much for sharing your time with us.
Thanks, Hank.
Pleasure. Take care, Hank.